everyone, welcome to the Jayda InStitches show. I thought today I would talk a little bit about how to read patterns. I'm going to have some basic pattern reading instruction in this video and also a few tips and tricks to just making the whole pattern reading process easier. And if you're still learning how to read patterns, then I've got some tips for making that easier as well. So let's get started. To begin with, most patterns are broken down into sections. Now, they don't all necessarily have the same sections, they're not always in the same order, but most patterns have different sections in them. And the first of those is usually materials. The materials section of a pattern, just like a recipe, tells you the ingredients you're going to need and possibly even the different tools and utensils you're going to need in order to complete the recipe, or in our case, a pattern. So the materials section has your yarn. I'll explain how yarn breaks down in a minute, your hook size, other little things like maybe whether you're going to need a pair of scissors, a yarn needle, a measuring tape, stitch markers, and extra things. Sometimes there's extra stuff involved in a project, like amigurumi might need eyes or beads or buttons, a sewing needle and thread, things like that. So the materials section sets you up just like a recipe would for all the things you need. Inside the materials section, within the yarn section, you should look for these things in a project. The yarn will be broken down into parts. The fiber, especially if it's necessary, and the fiber of a yarn is whether it's cotton or acrylic or wool or a blend, it's the fiber that the yarn itself is made out of. And that can be very important depending on the project. The weight category, if you're in America or a Western nation, you're going to find that's usually the American standard weight category. So 1 number being super fine all the way up to 7 being the super bulky category. You also might find that they are listed in the ply category. I know in Australia and places over there, they use the ply system, which is sort of the how many ply are in the yarn. It still refers to the thickness of the yarn. And others still may be older or just use a completely different system for weight categories. There are also names. So the old British system, for example, there was worsted weight, double knit or DK, there was Aran weight, bulky, chunky. Their weight categories sort of had names moreover than, I should say, they had names rather than numbers or a ply system. So the weight category definitions of yarn continues to change, and it could be different depending on where you are or how old the pattern is. But all that is to say, the weight category refers to the thickness of the yarn. So it's good to be a little well versed on different thicknesses, the different weight categories, how they may appear, and where to find them on the label of your yarn. So all yarn labels will have a weight category on it, and sometimes you'll see multiple weight categories. It'll tell you the number of ply, it'll tell you the weight category in the American Standard System, and it may even say something like DK or worsted weight. After the materials section, you would probably find a legend, a stitch legend. Not all patterns have this, but I think a good pattern should have this. Stitch legends basically are giving you the shorthand definition for what you're going to find later on in the pattern. So for example, instead of writing out single crochet, double crochet every single time they want to use it in the pattern, much like in a recipe, I'm going to use that reference again, where a tablespoon is often shortened to TBSP, in a pattern, single crochet is often short formed to SC. And a stitch legend tells you what all of the short forms are, what they actually translate to, and that helps you read the pattern later on. So it's always good to read through that, even if you're familiar with most stitch shorthand, and most patterns use the same stitch shorthand. Some people use different or older or slightly different shorthand because of the language that they've used or the different patterns they've grown up reading, or maybe they're from a different part of the world, or maybe the stitch itself is a little bit different and has a similar shorthand to other stitches you may know. So it's always good to just quickly read through the legend just to make sure you're on the same page as the actual pattern you're doing. Gauge. Not all patterns have or need a gauge, but a pattern that is size specific, like for clothing and things like that, will have a gauge, and it's very important that you not only read through the gauge, but you check it before you do the pattern as well. Speaking from experience, if you think to yourself, oh, I used really cute yarn and I like this hook and I'm going to go ahead and make this baby jacket and it's supposed to be for an infant, but it ends up being big enough to fit like a 3-year-old, been there, done that. Always read and check the gauge before you start the rest of the pattern. The gauge tells you how many stitches per inch or stitches per centimeter your little sample should work out to based on the suggested yarn and the suggested hook size. And then it usually gives you some pointers. So for example, if your gauge tends to be tighter or smaller than what the gauge suggests you should be at, it'll tell you to either go up a hook size or try a larger yarn weight category, or to, if you can, loosen up your tension. If it's much, much bigger than the gauge tells you it should be, then you might need to make a, use a smaller weight category yarn, use a smaller hook size, or even tighten up your tension if you can do that. So the gauge tells you where you should be at, so that by the time you get all the way to the end of the project will be the size that it's supposed to, as opposed to being too big or too small. Notes. Some patterns, not all, but many patterns come with an entire notes section. The notes section is kind of a place for the pattern designer to just put a bunch of tips or other little things to keep in mind when you're working on the pattern. It depends entirely on the project itself, but typical things you might find are notes on how to read the pattern or how the pattern is going to read or appear, and things you might need to keep in mind. Like for example, if there's a stitch count that you should know at the end of every row, then the stitch count you should have at the end of a row will often be, you know, at the end of the row in parenthesis or in brackets, or they might mention it somewhere else. If it's not in the brackets or parenthesis at the end of every row in the pattern, for example, maybe every row is always the same, and so there might be a note about that in the general notes section. It might also have information about the stitch repeater. So maybe this is a basic stitch pattern that they're applying to another kind of a project, like a blanket or a hat or something, and there's a stitch multiplier that you can use to make it wider or narrower, or to, you know, address or augment the pattern as necessary. So there might be information on the stitch itself, like the actual stitch pattern. There could be information on the terminology they use. Maybe they're saying this is a shell pattern, but for the case of that pattern, a shell means 5 double crochets worked into the same stitch or space rather than maybe 3. Maybe it's a scallop pattern, and there's a little note about how this scallop pattern might differ from other scallop patterns. It's always good to read through the notes section, and if you get stuck throughout the pattern, to go back to the notes section and just see if there's something in those notes that kind of pertains to the little issue that may have popped up while you're working on the pattern. Notes are there for a reason, so it's always good to read those first before you get into the rest of the pattern. Then there's usually the pattern itself. The pattern is often titled pattern. It'll give you row by row instructions or round by round, depending on how the pattern is built. That's another thing that might be in the notes section, is whether or not you're working in the round or working back and forth. Notes are important, make sure you read them. But the pattern itself will usually be broken down row by row. You might see it labeled as row 1 or R1 or round 1. You might see row 2, row 3, row 4. If you see row 1 to 4 or row 1 to 16, you know that everything that appears on that line is what's happening on every one of those rows. So if row 1 through row 16, for example, in a pattern are the same thing, you chain 2 and you turn and you do the same pattern over and over again. Well, rather than writing the same thing 16 times, they'll just say row 1 to row 16, and these are the instructions. Chain 1, turn, chain 2, turn, or whatever it is, and you just keep repeating that row until you've done 16 rows, and then you would move on to row 17. Another thing you would probably see in that area is if there's an amigurumi that you're building or a stuffed toy, there might be a pause, and it might actually tell you pause stuff, and then it'll go back to the instructions row by row. And then inside each of those rows, you're going to see a whole lot of jargon. I often say it's a good idea, just like a recipe, to read through the entire pattern from start to finish, almost like you're reading a short story, and say it out loud to yourself, so that if you run into an instruction inside of a row before you've even started crocheting, it'll stop you and you can say, okay, what am I actually looking at here? What does this mean? What am I doing? And in that case, you can refer to the notes section. You can refer back to the stitch legend to see if it's just sort of a shorthand you're not familiar with. Or if you've really just kind of stumbled into it, read the instructions that come before it again and try to visualize crocheting it in your mind, because often that helps. It might be just a little something like there's a turn to it, or there's you're flipping it upside down. Not all patterns, but some accidentally miss instructions like that. Or older patterns assume that you know more about the construction of a garment or a specific doily, so that they leave out some rather important instructions. And if you're just reading it from top to bottom, you might not realize that maybe you've got to turn it, or while you're working on it, it naturally turns. There are little things like that that might pop out while you're building it, but it's a good idea and it's a good habit to read it from start to finish, just so if anything pops up that maybe you want to make a note of in the margin or you're not quite sure of, you can just double check the notes and the stitch legend and anywhere else in the maybe look at the picture if there's a picture, and that will help you understand the pattern a little bit better before you get crocheting and run into the frustration of being halfway through, you know, you're several rows into the project and not know what to do next. Okay, the jargon in a typical row of instruction in a pattern can look something like this. R1, that means row 1. Colon. That tells you that everything that comes after this colon is what you're supposed to do in this row. SC into the next 3 stitches. That would be single crochet. SC equals single crochet, and you double check that by looking at the stitch legend. Single crochet into the next 3 stitches. Okay, so that means you are single crocheting into each of the next 3 stitches that you come across. Now, if you have to do that all the way across, it might just say single crochet into each stitch across. It could say single crochet into every stitch in this row. It could say single crochet. And then just the number of stitches you're supposed to have at the end. So not all patterns spell it out to you, but if it's just what's in that row, that's all you need to do in row 1. It can get a lot more complicated than that though when you get into stitch patterns. So for example, if you see single crochet into the next stitch, comma, and then parentheses or brackets and something written in the brackets, everything that is contained in the bracket needs to be done before you move on to the rest of that instruction. So if you'll remember back to math class in high school, and I know a lot of you are going to roll your eyes and groan, but whenever you were doing math where you had stuff in brackets, you did the work in the brackets first before you did anything else. So quick example, if in brackets you saw 1 times 2, and then plus, and then more stuff in brackets, let's say 1 times 2 in brackets again, you would first do what was in the brackets, 1 times 2, that's 2. Then multiply that to the information in these brackets. In this case, let's say 1 times 2. Well, you do what's in those brackets, 1 times 2, that's 2. So that becomes 2 times 2 equals 4. You do the work in the bracket first before you move on, and it's no different in a crochet pattern. If you see information in a bracket, let's say 3 double crochet, chain 2, 3 double crochet in that bracket, do that, but look at what comes right after the bracket first. So if it says 3 times, you would do all of that 3 double crochet, chain 2, 3 double crochet, let's say into the next stitch. It might say into the next stitch. It could say 3 double crochet into the next stitch, 2 double crochet into the next stitch, 3 times. So you always look at what's right after that bracket. If it says 3 times, you would do everything in that bracket 3 times. If there's a lot going on in that bracket, so let's say it's 3 double crochet in the next stitch, 2 double crochet in the next stitch, 3 double crochet in the next stitch, 2 times, you would do that 3 double crochet, 2 double crochet, 3 double crochet, oh, I have to do it 3 times, and you would do that 3 times. The other thing that's used quite frequently in a row of pattern instruction are asterisks or little stars. And quite often you'll see, you know, 3 double crochet in the next stitch, comma, asterisk, and then a whole bunch of instruction. There could be bracket instruction in there, in which case, same rule applies. You do what's in the brackets before you continue. And it might just be, you know, in brackets, 3 double crochet, chain 1, into the next stitch, comma, 2 double crochet, chain 1, into the next stitch, comma. And if you see a star on either side of that line of instruction, and then repeat from star to end, everything that happens between the 2 stars, or the 2 asterisks, you would continue to repeat. So you would start here, go all the way to the next asterisk, start at the asterisk, do everything in between the asterisks, go back to the first asterisk, and start again. Whatever's in between the asterisks, you just keep doing that and repeating until you get to the end of the row or wherever that instruction tells you to go. It might say asterisk, repeat everything between the 2 asterisks 3 times to the end of the row. For 6 rows, it depends, but usually the use of asterisks is so that there's a lot more complicated information that you want to repeat again and again and again. So the information or the instruction you'll see in a bracket is usually much simpler, like 3 double crochet, chain 1, into the next stitch. or 3 double crochet, chain 1 3 times into the next stitch, or whatever the instruction is, but usually information contained in brackets is simpler information, and information that you're asked to repeat between asterisks is much more complicated. Like it's the entire stitch pattern that you have to repeat multiple times over the course of a row. And you'll see that quite a lot when you're working on stitch patterns that are easily multiplied up or or made smaller. So the ones that start with a foundation chain row that's a multiplier base. You'll see a lot of asterisk information usually for those, because that usually means that there's a complicated stitch pattern. Something like a lady's fan, for example, from our Victorian stitch sampler calendar blanket, and I'll show you a picture of that here. That's usually the hardest stuff for people to grasp. It's how to use the brackets and how to use the asterisks. But like I said, if you read through the pattern and you actually read it out loud, don't read the short form, don't say SC into the next stitch. Say the whole thing in long form, SC, not single crochet into the next stitch, asterisk, 3 double crochet into the next stitch, 2 double crochet into the next stitch, chain 5, whatever that information is, asterisk, repeat from asterisk to asterisk 8 times or until the end of the row, read it again. Then usually at the end of that row of instructions, you'll see the stitch count or the motif count you should have. And a motif, if you're wondering, is a repeating pattern or sequence, and it's usually, in the case of a pattern, a motif is a repeating sequence of stitches. So for example, a shell, 3 double crochet, for example, that classic granny shell can be considered a motif. So rather than counting all 3 double crochet, 3 double crochet, 3 double crochet, you would just say, oh, well, there were 3 shells. So the shell, the name of that little stitch combination, is also referred to as a motif. So you might see in brackets at the end how many stitches you should have at the end of the row, or perhaps how many motifs you should have at the end of the row. And after that, you'll often be given your turning instructions. You might just be told to turn. You might be told to chain a number of chains, which are for turning. That allows you to either use them as a stitch. There's often a note in the note section about that. For example, the chain 3 at the beginning of the row counts as a double crochet. That's a common note, and you should see that in the notes section. Unless it's a one-off, in which case in the body of the pattern, you know, the chain 3 counts as a double crochet. May only happen once. It depends on the pattern you're doing. But after your row count or your stitch count at the end of a row instruction, you might see turning instructions. Turning usually means to flip your work to go back across what you've just done. So typically, if you're working flat or working back and forth in crochet, you work first in one direction, right to left, for example, if you're right-handed, left to right, if you're left-handed, and then if you're told to turn, you flip your work so that you're then going back across that row in the other direction. Sometimes, if you're working on a blanket, for example, and you're working on the border pattern, you might see the word rotate, which means that you're not flipping the blanket, you're just rotating it so that you're working down another edge as opposed to working back and forth. And sometimes you might see work in the round, in which case you're just kind of continually working in the round like a spiral, and you're not joining rows, you're not turning, you're just always going in the same direction, which eventually turns you into a spiral or a circle. Again, you should see notes to that effect in the notes section. And finally, at the end of a pattern, sometimes you'll see little extras. There might be a section on tips or fun pattern variations that are easy and not too difficult, and once you've made the pattern once, you might want to try it again with a different weighted yarn or a novelty yarn, or maybe make it larger, make it small, or something that could affect how a pattern looks, but might be kind of fun to try. So pattern variations, maybe extra tips and tricks that weren't really part of the main pattern and didn't quite fit into the notes section, but might be kind of fun to try. You also might find a personal notes section. Sometimes recipes and other patterns, even sewing patterns, have a little section where you can keep notes for yourself. We all process information differently. I think that's something that most of us know once we get to adulthood, but we all process information differently. We all learn at different rates. Some of us are visual, some of us are audio, some of us really need to read something, some of us need to see it demonstrated. We all learn in different ways, and we all process information in different ways. So it's really a great idea, if you're in the habit of keeping patterns and making notes on patterns, to really keep notes on that pattern. If there's no room on the pattern itself, you know, we've all put notes in the margin before, drawn a little arrow and made a note, but having a note section in a pattern is often a really nice thing to have, especially if it's the kind of pattern where you're given instructions for changing it, either because you might want to make it larger or smaller or try it with a different yarn. So a little note section is a nice to have. It's not a necessary, but it's a nice to have if you want to make notes. And I'm the kind of person that when I make a pattern, I have a lot of notes, often for myself, maybe the yarn I use, the fiber I tried, a hook that worked better. For example, if you have a lot of different hooks and they're by different manufacturers, you might find that my clover hook, you know, 5.5 millimeter was better for this pattern than my Bates 5.5 millimeter hook, you know, because they vary a little bit, and I found it easier to use this hook with this pattern than this one. Little notes like that. Whatever strikes your fancy, whatever you think might help you down the road if you were going to make that pattern again, you leave that note in the note section as a sort of a little reminder to yourself. Finally, some patterns, not all, but some, have photographs in them or diagrams. Photographs and diagrams are really handy because they're just there to sort of help explain something, maybe the way something should look or the kind of something you're looking for as you're working through a pattern that is easier expressed in a photo or a diagram than it is writing it all down. Sometimes you'll see in the body of a rose pattern instruction, in brackets, you know, this will be the space between the chain 3 and the double crochet next to it. See photograph below. Because you might be thinking, what do you mean between the chain 3 and the space between? I don't understand that. A space is that well, if you look at the photo below and then you compare it to the work you're working on, because generally that photo in that row information comes at the same time that you would have gotten there, you'll go, oh, that's the space. Or, okay, yeah, my work looks like that. And photographs throughout a pattern help to kind of keep you on track as well. You might think to yourself, is it supposed to look like this? Am I doing this right? Am I going in the right direction? And if you've got photographs to kind of compare your work to, then use them. Look at the photograph, compare your work to it, lay it flat or hold it the way it's being held in the actual pattern photo, and that will help you see if you're on track, if things look right, and maybe if you've gone off track a little bit, check those photos as you go so that you can stop a problem in its tracks, back up and start again without getting too far into the rest of the pattern. So if you see photos or you're directed to look at a photo or a diagram, take a pause from the crochet and always check the photo and the diagram. Check your work against it. They're there for a reason. That was a bit of a long video, but that is generally the overview on how to read most crochet patterns. Knitting patterns are very similar too, so if you were here for one or the other, they're basically the same thing. Stitch legend is important, the materials section is important, always read the notes. Proofread the entire pattern before you start because it will give you an idea of what's coming up and what you should expect as you work through it. If there are photos and diagrams, double check your work against them and make use of the notes section. If there's a section to put your own notes in, then leave little reminders and little sort of tips and tricks to yourself down the road if you want to come back and make that pattern again. Because speaking as somebody who crochets constantly and designs and writes patterns, I have made some things a dozen times, but then a year goes by before I make it and I need to refer to my own notes on a pattern, even if I design the pattern myself. So it's really helpful to leave yourself notes, and I highly recommend that you get into the habit of doing that if you're going to collect and read patterns. The crochet world is massive, and I think most of it is still in written pattern format. So I hope you found this video helpful, and I hope it will give you the confidence you need to sit down and struggle your way through a project from just the written pattern and not feel that you need to rely on a video tutorial or even someone else's help as much. Being able to read a pattern and make a project from someone else's written words, for me it's like being able to cook something up in the kitchen by just reading the recipe. You assemble all the ingredients, you read through the recipe, you preheat the oven, you get all the right tools, you mix it together in the right order, you put it in the oven, you cross your fingers and hope, and then it comes out perfectly and you feel awesome because you didn't need somebody else to necessarily show you how to do it. So reading a pattern is like reading a recipe, and being able to make the finished project just from reading it's pretty cool. It's almost a bit magical. Anyway, we hope you enjoyed, and we will see you soon here on the Jayda InStitches show. Until then, stay safe, stay crafty, and have a great week. Bye guys.
Hi everybody, Mr. InStitches here. Thank you for watching today. Here are some of our other videos you might be interested in. Oh, and don't forget to subscribe.